Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Slisher. As you know, this is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today we're going to be discussing the sign of Aries. I'm working my way through all the individual zodiac signs, so you'll get a good idea what the backdrop is for a person who's an Aries. Aries is the very first sign of the zodiac, so guess what they like to be? They like to be first. Aries is the strongest, one of the most dynamic signs of the whole entire zodiac. It is a cardinal fire sign. Aries is a fire sign and is a cardinal fire sign. I told you in the past what a cardinality meant. Cardinality people are people who start things. There's one for each of the four elements, but the cardinal sign for fire is Aries. Aries is the new first beginner of the zodiac, and they are actually begin on March the 20th, which I think as an astrologer is the equivalent of New Year's Day. That's not just because I have a bias towards astrology, but I also believe that in the natural cycle of things, it is really the beginning of the new year. It's when symbolically, it's when, in Christianity, it was the time of rebirth. It's the time of the winter being gone. It's the time of new grass and new leaves coming to light. So I see that as a beginning more than I do as, sort of the middle of the road, as they refer to it as, the equinox. It's not the same as that. I think of it more, it's referred to as the vernal equinox around the 21st of March, but I think of it as the new year. That's just my personal interpretation, so you can do with that what you like. But when we talk about that, and actually the new year for everybody is different. In my opinion, the new year for anybody is, New Year's Day for anybody is their birthday. When you return to your birthday each year, that's your New Year's Day. And you should set your goals based on that day, based on what's called the solar return chart, which is when the sun returns all the way back to the same degree where it was when you were born, okay? But today we're talking about Aries. Aries, as I said, is a fire sign. It's a cardinal sign. It's represented by the ram. And what does the ram do? The ram has got horns on his head, and he goes charging in, and he bangs his head into things, and is very impulsive and very aggressive. And aggressive is the word for an Aries. And there's many words that are associated with Aries that I use that begin with A. Aggressive, ambitious, anxious, angry. So there's all these words that are there. All those words are about initiation. It's about emotion. It's about moving things forward. Aries are also very known for being impulsive. They are the kind of people who love to start things, just like the goat, the ram I mentioned earlier, charging off into the woods or charging into the field, blazing trails. They are the trailblazers. They are the courageous people, and they are the ones who act on action. Action is what fuels an Aries, and that's a wonderful quality to have in a person. One of the downsides to the side of the Aries is that because they are so driven by action and newness and beginning, they seldom finish things up that they start. Now, this is a broad-based, sweeping generality about Aries in general, but for the most part, a lot of Aries will get very interested in one subject, totally jump into it full, both feet into the subject, and then only to lose interest after a period of time, oftentimes not seeing it through to the very end. Tenacity is not one of their characteristics. Being inventive, being intuitive, being quick, being ambitious, impulsive, those are the words that we think of when we think of Aries, and it's very, very accurate. They can also be very explosive as a result of that spark of energy that comes out. And also, unfortunately, they can be a little bit self-centered because it's number one, and Aries is all about me. Me is the big word for Aries. And oftentimes, if you know any Aries in your life, that's who you will find to be that type of person. They will be the sort of person who loves to charge off, loves to be number one, loves to be top of the stack. And that doesn't mean that everybody who is number one or is competitive is an Aries. However, those people who are Aries will always exhibit that kind of tendency in their lives. They tend to be very egotistical, very self-centered, as I mentioned, very selfish. And this is a broad-based kind of of generalization I'm making. And I don't want you to go off and say, oh, you're an Aries, you're selfish, you're egocentrical. These are terms that we see and we equate with each individual sign. Each individual sign, as you know in the past, as I've mentioned, is a composite of good and evil. We are dualistic characters. We have good parts, we have bad parts. We have our extroverted self that we present to the world. We have our introverted system of ourself and our private side as well. This is a part of what it means to be a human. We are a composite of this. And that being a composite of this means that we have the ability to try to strive and find balance within the duality of life. Life is a dualistic system. We see it within everything that we see in our lives. We see the pluses, we see the minuses, we see the black, we see the white, we see the right, we see the wrong, we see the up, we see the down, we see the left lung, we see the right lung, we see the right hand, we see the left hand. All of these are very apropos and very much a part of what it means to be a human being. But with Aries, Aries is this sort of the grand starter. They're the ones who initiate. The best word for Aries, if I had to pick one word, would be the warrior. Why the warrior? Because Mars is its ruling planet. Mars is the planet of war. Mars is the planet of aggression. It's the planet of ambition. It's the planet of anger. All those A words, initiation, are the key words behind an Aries. Aries are oftentimes the ones that are out ahead of the pack, leading down the road, everybody following behind them. And it's interesting, you'll see this in different ways in your life. You'll see people as the Aries are being the ones who have the first idea to do something. They're the first one who starts the fashion industry. They're the first one who comes up with the new ideas, and all of a sudden people are following them. They have an uncanny ability to be ahead of the curve. Why that is, I think it's because it's part of the zodiac. And again, getting back to the metaphor of the spring, it's the rebirth and it's the time. Red is their color. So guess what I am? Yes, I am an Aries. And I have to say that, and my birthday is March 32nd. I know you're all going to say there is no such thing as March 32nd, but March 32nd to me is the same thing as April 1st. That's my little inside joke. So you could say, well, isn't that guy egotistical, making jokes about himself? And yes, you're right, but that's part of what it is to be an Aries. You have to be the ones that are out there starting things, the ones that are out there charging through your life and being that very important person. Now, when we look at Aries and we think about the sign that it rules and where Mars is in the chart, wherever Mars is in the chart is typically a strong indicator of who the individual is. We look to where Mars is as being the motivator for an individual. Where is Mars in a chart? It's the ruler of Aries, but we each have that in our charts as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the individual houses, because when we have our charts laid out, don't forget I've talked about this in the past, our charts are oriented based on our time of birth. Our time of birth is dictated by the ascendant, or the actual time that the sun is on the horizon at our moment of birth. That varies throughout the course of the day. There's 24 hours in a day, there's 12 signs. The sun is what's called the ecliptic, or the horizon, for 12 hours, for 2 hours of each day, giving it that 2-hour window. So some people may have that, and that sets the orientation of the astrology chart. That is where we see the action happening, because each chart is oriented differently. When I talk about orientation, I talk about the placement of the chart, because if you have a different kind of ascendant, your houses are going to fall in different areas, and your sun may fall in different area. You may be in Aries, but your sun is not going to fall in the first house unless you were born at 6 or 7 in the morning on your birthday. So if you're in Aries and you were not born at that time, your houses are going to be different. So let's think about that. If an Aries is on your ascendant and you have Aries in the first house and you were born early in the morning in Aries, you're going to exhibit those qualities of an Aries very distinctly. You're going to be very animated, very extroverted, ambitious, the real true leader, flying through the cosmos at the greatest of speed, trying to find where you're going. And by the way, Aries falls between March 20th and April 19th of the year. So falling in that time, that is the birth of spring, and at least in the Western Hemisphere, but it is a change of the seasons as well. And I'm speaking from the Western Hemisphere, so I'm going to speak to that type of framework. But when we look at that, we see someone who's very driven, very perhaps even argumentative if they have Aries in the first house, but they are a driven person. They are a person who is driven by an inner desire to get their points across, and they express their ego strongly. And Aries, in the second house, if Aries lands in your second house, or your sun falls in your second house and you are in Aries, you're going to be particularly driven by money and resources and wealth. And that type of energy is very often found. We'll see that in hedge fund managers and real estate developers and bankers. People who have Aries in the first house are always those kind of people who have that strong desire to be successful and to acquire resources, to acquire and to be dictatorial in that regard. Also, when we move on to the next house, we see Aries in the third house. And Aries in the third house, with the Sun and Aries in the third house, or Mars in the third house, is particularly driven by the ability to communicate. Communication is a key piece of what they do. They may be writers, they may be broadcasters, they may be radio hosts, they may be television hosts. Hint. And if that's the case, they are usually pretty good at that and not ashamed, and often the ones who are out there blazing the trails regarding that topic. Next Aries quality, if we move from Aries and we find the Sun in Aries in the fourth house, that person would be particularly motivated around the home and the family. Very much of a home and family oriented person would be with an Aries Sun in the fourth house. An Aries Sun in the fifth house would be a very creative person. This would be the sort of person who would be incredibly, maybe perhaps a great inventor, someone who was able to invent and innovate, and strong characteristics there. Very strong ability to be creative, you know, a blazer, a real trailblazer. And I'm going to give you some names of people who are famous Aries, and we could determine where they were if we knew their charts and looked them up. An Aries with a sixth house, an Aries Sun in the sixth house would be indicative of a person who is driven to serve. This is a person who wants to serve the world, someone who is out there trying to perhaps do better for the earth, or perhaps could be a person who is in the medical field. The world of service is that. Doesn't mean you're a waitress at a donut shop or a mechanic. It means that you are someone who is dedicated to service. And service is a wonderful characteristic. So it's important that you understand the terms. And the houses I'm going to be getting into eventually as we go down the road here further, and I will give you the attributes of the houses so you can always refer back to this and find that out as well. And my website has got a lot of information. turningofthewheel.com is my website, or my first and last name, chrisflishertogether.com is my website as well. I encourage you to go there to get information about your personal chart. I can help you through that process. When we see Aries in the seventh house is the house of typically ruled by Libra, which is Aries opposite, and it is the house of relationship. When we see an Aries Sun in the sign of, in the seventh house rather, we see a person who is driven by working with others. This is a person who wants to be involved in a relationship, who sees their goal as, who sees their real true purpose coming through communion. And I don't mean the religious communion, but I mean in union with another person. It's through joint partnership that they achieve their greatest gain. Someone who may be supportive of that person is who that typical Aries would be bound to. When we see Aries in the eighth house, or if the Sun falls in the eighth house and we have Aries in the eighth house, we see a deeply spiritual person, a person who has a certain regard for spirituality, who may work in a large organization, who has a distinct fascination for what I would call the dark side of life. This is sort of the things that are underneath the table, so to speak, you know, beneath the covers. These are things that are more germane to secrecy. We might find someone working for the FBI. We might find a secret agent man might be an Aries with the Sun in the eighth house. It would be a perfectly normal spot for that undercover agent, a CIA agent, something like that. Very much the case. When we see Aries Sun in the ninth house, we see someone who is driven by teaching and spirituality, teaching and traveling. This might be an Aries who travels quite a bit, who manifests their leadership through going to new countries, blazing new trails, charging up the Amazon River, and sort of those things. So areas that are not known to others. This is where travel and education and the broadening of the mind, this is the area where we find this great broadening of the mind, bringing in more information so that you're enriched and able to make better decisions because you're absorbed more. This is the great area of the research and the inclusion of new information. Of course, the ninth house is exactly opposite the third house, so communication and education obviously go hand in hand. Very good point. When we see Aries in the 10th house, when we see Aries in the 10th house, where this is the house of career, we're likely to see someone who's very, very driven by success with regard to career. Someone who's a natural leader, a CEO, a person who owns their own company. This may be, and country for that matter. This is a person who is an entrepreneur, someone who wants to be in charge and is very successful at what they do. This is another key point. They are very successful at what they do. And it's interesting because when you see an Aries employee, a person who has a career and their Aries sun is in the 10th house, we somebody who's very motivated to succeed. So sales might be a prominent place for someone like that. Someone who is very motivated. Again, think of that word, aggressive, motivation, anger, action, and I wouldn't focus on anger so much but anger, if it's channeled in the right direction, can be incredibly useful. It is a impetus. It is a motivator of sorts. It is a fire within. That's the key. Fire, Aries is a fire sign, so that fire within is one who has that fire, that ability to get things started, to light the fire, to get things going. So if you have an Aries, if you're an Aries and your sun is in the 10th house, you're likely to be a very successful person. You're likely to be driven. As I said, sales is very good. They're very competitive. Aries are very, very competitive. When we look at the ruling planet of Mars, as I said, Mars is the planet of motivation. We find many great athletes with a highly elevated Mars in their chart. Again, because that element of competition is there. So an Aries with a 10th house sun, the sun in the 10th house and an Aries, would be someone who's very competitive. So sales obviously would be good. Any place where you'd find leadership, whether it be for themselves or working under the auspices of a large organization where they were in charge of a group or something like that. Leadership is their key word. Leadership is a key word for an Aries. The next house we move to is the house of groups and business associates, which is the house of the 11th house, associations. When we find an Aries sun in the 11th house, we see someone who is motivated to commingle, to coexist, to collaborate, to work together with others. This is an incredible time when we find the Aries is willing to lead through collaboration. And that's not usual for an Aries, because Aries typically likes to be the sole top dog in a situation. But when they work with others, they find, especially with the Aries in the 11th house, they find that their ability to get things done happens through the ability to shed their own ego and collaborate with others. Take in the outside advice from others. Take in outside stimuli. See what other people are providing, and then add their own Arian mix to it, and then push that project forward. It's a great area where we find people in the process of collaboration. This is a very good space. And of course you'd find a leader in business communities, so people who belong to the Rotary Club or the Elks Clubs or any sort of, even Greenpeace or whatever the case may be, whatever the organization may be, this is where you'll find the Aries. The Aries will be there helping others to collaborate. When we come to the 12th house, the 12th house is the house of transition. And the house of transition, as you've heard me mention in the past, is the house of beginnings and endings. This is an area. Now, if you have a 12th house sun in Aries, you're about beginning and ending. And that makes sense because Aries is all about beginning. This is where you'll see a sort of a subhuman or superhuman desire to either begin things or to end things. An interesting example of this would be someone such along the lines as a Donald Trump. Donald Trump has Mars, which is he's not an Aries, he's a Gemini, but he has his Mars, which is a ruling planet represented by Aries, which again represents motivation, in his 12th house. And we've seen how driven he is to have people come to him. Now, when we look at the other parts of Aries, we see there's lots of different characteristics that come into it. The opposite of Aries is the Libra. The Libra is the soft person who is the compliant, not so compliant so much, but a softer, more intellectually driven kind of person who likes to have the conversation, who likes to take things slower, whereas the Aries is charging straight on. Now, most people think, you've heard the expression opposites attract. Well, actually, it really is true, especially in the horoscope and in the zodiac and in astrology. The opposite of Aries is the Libra. And when you put the Aries and the Libra together, we get a symbiotic relationship, meaning that they are complementary. The Aries fire needs the Libra air to get that fire to go. Between the two of them, they have this remarkable ability to become a whole. Oftentimes you'll find very, very successful couples, not always, I can't make that generalization, but very oftentimes you'll find people who have successful couples and relationships are based on pairing with their opposites. They recognize something, and this is true for all astrology signs. It's not just Aries. It's true for Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, the whole show, all the way down the list. There's always an opposite. And the opposite fulfills something in the individual that they can't provide themselves. We don't come onto this planet as complete people. We come on as with a job to do. We have areas of our lives that need to be fulfilled. We have areas of our lives that need to be accommodated, and areas of our lives that we need to improve. We are a bundle of assets and liabilities. So we have our assets. Every person has their assets, but we also have our liabilities. And our liabilities are areas where we need to work. And that's where the Libra would come in. So an Aries, and this is a generalization, the particulars of the astrology chart are best determined by the individual. So the terms that I'm using and the phrases I'm using and the terminology I'm using and sort of the sweeping generalizations I'm using all do apply to Aries, but in a broad sense. We are all a composite of all the signs. When you look at the zodiac wheel, you're going to see a piece of the pie occupied by each of the individual signs. The difference is where your sun is, where your moon is, and where your significant planets are. Those are going to carry more weight and will color your personality accordingly based on what you have in that area of your chart. So the individual, if a person has Mercury, which is the planet that represents communication, if that person has a Mercury in the 3rd house, they're going to be a writer. So you see what I'm saying? And much of this information comes out in the individual astrology consultation. An individual astrology consultation is very much like going to see a therapist in some way. It allows a person who doesn't know you to see completely who you are. And they provide a roadmap of where you are and where you should be going. The astrology is incredibly useful for planning out life events, understanding who you are, what your career is, who you're here for, and what is your purpose on this planet. This is a critical piece of what astrology provides. It is a rule, owner's manual is what I refer to it as. It provides you with an owner's manual of who you are as an individual. That individual was brought onto this planet at a certain place and time, certain date, place and time, for a specific reason. That purpose is who you are. And when you know what that purpose is, and you hear a perfect stranger who knows nothing more about you, such as myself, nothing more about you than your birth date, your birthplace, and your birth time, and I tell you who you are, what your likes, dislikes are, what your assets and liabilities are, and you have that aha moment, you know it works. Back a long time ago when I first started the show, I told you the story about how I met a perfect stranger years ago when I was about 20 years old, and I gave them my birth date, my birthplace, and my birth time, long before I was an astrologer. And they came back to me the next day. I never met them before in my life. They sat down with me with 6 or 7 pages of handwritten text about who I was, and they knew me better than I knew myself. And all the things that they mentioned about me, maybe they hadn't happened yet, but they have happened since. And I did not go into that I did not come out of that conversation saying, oh, I'm going to go and be a television host at some day or an astrologer. I didn't know that. But they made mention of those ideas and those themes. So it is there. We do have a manifest destiny. We are here for a purpose, and that purpose is brought about and recognized and symbolically represented in the astrology chart. It is as clear as day. And what's best about it is that when you work with the dynamic of the chart, brought into the world of where you are today in your life, you will see how accurate it is for the types and the themes of things that you're going through at that time. Now, I mentioned I was going to get into some of the famous Aries so you'd have an idea of who these people were. My favorite of all Aries is Vincent van Gogh. I can think of no better person who represents the Aries than Vincent van Gogh. That aggression, that passion, the red hair even, that ability to be passionate and impulsive and angry and aggressive and impulsive and yet incredibly creative. He had this ability that was beyond. He blazed the trail, typical Aries quality. He blazed the trail for people unlike any other as far as contemporary art goes. There's probably no other figure in the world of art that people recognize more than Van Gogh. Picasso, I suppose, Renoir, Rembrandt, Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci. These are all famous artists, yes, but Vincent van Gogh left his mark. He blazed through his time on Earth like a house on fire. He just flew through here and came to an untimely death very young in his life. But what a legacy he left behind. You can almost see him furiously dashing on those paints. If you've never seen a movie, there's a great movie that stars Kirk Douglas called Lust for Life. It's all about the life of Vincent van Gogh. He epitomizes him perfectly. You see him throwing the paints on and dashing and experimenting with ways that no one had done before. He's a perfect example of what an Aries is. And incidentally, speaking of Leonardo da Vinci, he also was an Aries. And Leonardo da Vinci was known not only as an artist, but as an incredible inventor. He was the one who invented helicopters and airplanes and wells and gears and all sorts of mechanisms. He had the underpinnings of all these early inventions on paper long before they were ever discovered by the rest of us, the rest of humanity. So Leonardo da Vinci was also a trailblazer in that regard. These are the people we see through history who were the great leaders with the arts, perhaps, and inventions, and all sorts of areas. They are the ones that are out there leading the charge. Impulsivity is there, aggression is there, but still they are there. Other people, Gloria Steinem, of all people. Gloria Steinem is an Aries. Now, doesn't that make sense when you think about the movement and the women's movement, the feminist movement? Gloria Steinem, bright, young, attractive, intelligent woman who was raised on the road with her father, who was a traveling salesman, went on to become a Playboy bunny. Who would have thought a feminist would be a Playboy bunny? She started out as a Playboy bunny and then became an arch feminist and became the voice of feminism. She literally defined what modern feminism would become as we march through our time. And I just saw her recently speak, and she's still out there blazing trails. So she is a trailblazer in that regard. Very few people have come close to her with regard to being the initiator, the great starter, the great starter. Other people that come to mind, Hans Christian Andersen was an Aries. He's a famous Danish fairy tale poet and writer. Johann Sebastian Bach. Johann Sebastian Bach. Who has not heard a Bach cantata or a Bach chorale or a Bach piece of music in any religious format you may belong in? Bach was an incredibly prolific, very, very prolific composer and way ahead of his time. Way ahead of his time. So just there alone, Vincent van Gogh, Leonardo da Vinci, Gloria Steinem, and Johann Sebastian Bach. I don't have to say any more. You can see who these people are. Real, true trailblazers in their fields. Remarkable. But we have more. Ravi Shankar was an Aries. Joseph Haydn was an Aries. Eric Clapton. Muddy Waters. Muddy Waters gave birth to the blues in many ways. There's people before him, absolutely. But he certainly was one who blazed the trail and set in place, opened the doors for others. This is what the Aries do, more than anything else. They open the doors. These are the great door openers. It doesn't sound quite complimentary, but it's true. It is true. They're the ones that open the doors. They're the ones that are out in the jungle with the machete chopping down the path for everybody to follow behind them. They're the ones, the ram, charging through the fields, desperately trying to find that new way. They're always the leaders. So just those names I mentioned alone, Vincent van Gogh, Johann Sebastian Bach, Leonardo da Vinci, Gloria Steinem, great Muddy Waters, great trailblazers who are out there leading the charge, always ahead of their game. And right now, in this current frame that work that we're in right now, the planet Uranus is in Aries. Has been since the year 2008, when it first stepped into, 2011 rather, when it first stepped into Aries, and hasn't been there for 84 years. And Uranus in Aries is all about invention, and that's why we're coming to a time where we see great invention coming to light. The internet, the cell phone, our lives have dramatically changed. Aries is a leader. Aries is a pioneer. Aries is self-centered. Aries is passionate. Aries is the one to follow. Thank you.